That's always been an essential part of the American dream. In the past, it's been, I think, primarily defined as a quantitative better life. Make more money, have a bigger house, have more cars. So I've been trying to encourage with this book and in my personal appearances a recalibration of the answer to that. We should be concentrating, it seems to me, on the quality of life, not just on how many toys we can accumulate by the time that we check out or get to our senior years. We should be talking a lot more about economic opportunity for all. And the underpinning of that, of course, is to repair our broken education system, especially the public school system. I'm encouraged that we're now beginning to talk about it, and in the great urban areas of America, it's on the agenda, but we've got a long way to go. And as Lissa mentioned just a moment ago, we're competing in a much different universe. When Ronald Reagan came to Washington and Paul Volcker began to change the credit situation in this country in an attempt to get inflation under control, and we went into a sharp recession, and unemployment was high for a long time. When we came out of that recession, we weren't competing against China and Brazil and Russia, and oil was $20 a barrel in those days. There have been objective changes that have profoundly affected our ability to compete in the world in the 21st century. And then I began to think about historians and how they'll judge this time. And in gatherings like this, I would say to folks, whatever you believe, whatever your standing in life, economically or culturally or socially or politically, I do think it's time for all of us to metaphorically raise our hands and re-enlist as citizens, to not let this time go by, this opportunity to address the great challenges that are out there, and they're hard. It's all in for America. I was on NPR earlier today, and a number of the callers were putting all the blame on Wall Street. Wall Street was the most visible and certainly the most villainous, I think, of the institutions in the downturn. But the fact is that there was a lot of lack of personal responsibility as well, and a failure of people to raise their hands and say, this won't do. This doesn't make sense as we go forward. Lissa mentioned 1% versus 99% in terms of the military. It's not just unjust for a democratic society to send less than 1% of its population to take 100% of the bullets in its wars. It's really immoral in my judgment. And we've left behind families who are going to be dealing with lost members, and also those who come home physically or emotionally damaged, to working class communities and middle class communities, because those are the people who step forward. And nothing was asked of the rest of us. Nothing was asked by our government or by our communities. So that's probably a place to begin, to think about how we begin to close that gap and stitch together the society between those who served in uniform and are now coming home to an economy for which they're not prepared to take their place because they've been warriors for the last 8 or 9 or 10 years. And it's an economy that doesn't have a lot of openings for them. That, it seems to me, is a place to begin. Education is going to be the currency of the 21st century. And we have to have a greater urgency about how we repair it here. There are some encouraging signs beyond the development, as I indicated earlier, of people now putting it on the agenda, stepping forward, private companies getting involved because this is their workforce. These are also their consumers at some point. One of the most dramatic developments that is going on is the explosion in community colleges across the country. Because not everybody, A, wants to go to a 4-year university and come out with a degree in humanities or literature. There are a lot of young people who want to go and get a real skill set for the modern age. That ought to be encouraged. There are demonstrations all across the country, especially in the industrial Midwest, of these schools now that are exploding, and they're a very good bargain. I have a relative, my wife's cousin, who is involved with one in Tulsa, but he wrote to me the other day to say, you still can't believe how unprepared students are coming out of public schools to get an education. They need remedial math and remedial reading programs just to do the most fundamental work that the modern workplace is going to require. So how do we get on with that? Well, one of the ways that I think that we ought to get on with it is to begin to step forward. I use the phrase re-enlist the citizens. But it's not just a ritual. It really means that we have to make a commitment. This may surprise a lot of people in the room, but I've been saying around the country as I go, whatever you think of the Tea Party, they played by the rules. They got angry, they got organized, they got here, and they stayed on message with enormous discipline. And that's why they're driving the debate right now, the presidential nomination race on the Republican side, because they're there at every turn. I think that they're much too narrowly cast in terms of what their objectives are, but that's how we've always changed America, from the ground up. Coalitions that are put together around common cause. We have to reach across the lines to find each other. I say to young audiences, you know, it's an amazing thing. Dr. King changed this country more profoundly than almost any other single person that I have known in my lifetime in terms of who we are now. He liberated America, not just black America, but all of us from the strictures of racism and all that that meant. Somehow he managed to do it without tweet, without a cell phone. He didn't go online every night. He wasn't blogging. This is the power of his oratory, strengths of his belief, and his ultimate test in the greatness of this country and the rule of law. Thurgood Marshall was his partner in that. And think of how much change he was able to effect. And the courage of the young people, and mostly the older people in those days who were the African Americans at the time, because in some ways they had less to lose on a daily basis than those who were in the workplace. The courage of them to step forward and stay true to philosophy of nonviolence. It was one of the most remarkable things that I'll ever see in my lifetime. So we have to think in those terms, it seems to me, and that's what I'm trying to say here. And at the end, of course, I talk about my own life experiences, my wife's grandparents and their influence on her, and my grandparents and their influence on me, and I end up with a couple of stories about my own relationship with our grandchildren. I'll just share one which comes toward the end of the book as I wrap it up here. Meredith and I are very active outdoors people. We found the West. After we left South Dakota, we rediscovered it in a way by going out and backpacking first in the California Sierra and then in Montana and Wyoming and other places. So when our girls' granddaughters got old enough, we thought to begin to introduce them to the idea. They were just 7 and 5 at the time, and I said, well, we're going to go on an overnight camping trip up into the Montana wilderness. There's a backcountry cabin where we knew that they would be comfortable. It wasn't taxing or too arduous, but it was tough. It was off trail, up the mountain, down through a steep valley, up another mountain, and then get to this cabin where we cooked outside and had the meal. And then we said to the girls, you're going to sleep in the cabin in your sleeping bags. It's a tiny shelter, really, for cowboys during roundup time, and we'll be just outside in our sleeping bags. And we had little headlamps that they could use, and you could kind of see they were wide-eyed and a little bit anxious about that, but we assured them everything would be okay. So when it got dark, and it gets really dark in the wilderness, and they were inside, and Meredith and I were outside in our sleeping bags, we could hear kind of a buzz going on inside. They were talking to each other. And then all of a sudden, the youngest of the two came out and said to Meredith, who is called Nan, said, Nan, we need an adult in here now. I think the country needs an adult in here now. So that's how I came to write this book. And I do have some things to say that I think that by and large will be, I hope, provocative, but mostly useful, and will start the conversation that we should all have. And with that, let's start the conversation here. So if you have any questions.